The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the mahogany table as Marcus Thorne's fork clattered against bone china, the sound sharp enough to slice through the gentle murmur of conversation that had filled Meridian's dining room moments before. His hand, which had been gesturing emphatically about quarterly projections just seconds earlier, now pressed against his chest with desperate urgency. The crimson tie that his assistant had straightened that morning suddenly felt like a noose around his neck. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus? Victoria Ashworth, seated to his right, leaned forward with the practiced concern of someone who had navigated countless boardroom crises. Her diamond earrings caught the light as she tilted her head, studying his face. "You look pale." The restaurant's ambient lighting, carefully designed to flatter aging executives and make expensive wine appear even more luxurious, couldn't hide the gray pallor that had crept across Marcus's features like storm clouds gathering over a summer picnic. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the perfectly controlled climate that kept Meridian at an optimal 72 degrees year-round. Across the table, Jonathan Hayes paused mid-sentence in his animated description of the Shanghai expansion, his mouth still forming words that would never come. The three other board members, Eleanor Reeves, David Park, and Thomas Caldwell, turned their attention from their respective conversations about market volatility and regulatory challenges to focus on their CEO, who was now gripping the table's edge with white knuckles. "I'm fine," Marcus managed to whisper, though the words came out strained, like air escaping from a punctured tire. He tried to smile, that same reassuring expression that had calmed nervous investors through 2 recessions and a hostile takeover attempt, but his lips barely moved and his eyes held a wildness that none of them had ever seen before, not even during the congressional hearings 3 years ago when their company's accounting practices had come under scrutiny. Maya Rodriguez moved between the tables with the fluid grace of someone who had perfected the art of invisibility. In her 2 years at Meridian, she had learned to read the subtle language of the city's elite, the way they held their wine glasses when they wanted to be left alone, the particular angle of their shoulders when they were ready for the check, the soft clearing of throats that meant they needed something but were too polite to ask directly. Tonight she carried herself with the same quiet confidence, her black uniform pressed to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that her grandmother had taught her to tie when she was 12 years old. But something was wrong. Maya felt it in the way the conversation at table 7 had suddenly stopped, like a record player yanked from its socket. She glanced over from where she was refilling water glasses at table 12 and saw Marcus Thorne, the man whose photograph graced the financial section of newspapers and whose signature appeared on checks that kept half the city employed, struggling to breathe. The other diners seemed frozen in their expensive suits and designer dresses, their faces reflecting the kind of helpless confusion that comes when people accustomed to controlling everything suddenly encounter something beyond their influence. Maya had seen that look before, in different contexts, in different worlds. She had seen it on her brother's face when their father had his first heart attack 6 years ago. She had seen it on her mother's face in the emergency room when the doctor spoke in medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language. Marcus's breathing became more labored, each inhale a visible struggle. His left arm, which had been gesturing so confidently just minutes before, now hung limply at his side. The expensive watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Maya made in 2 years, caught the light as his hand trembled against the white tablecloth. "Should we call someone?" Eleanor Reeves asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 30 years making executive decisions, but now sounded uncertain, almost childlike. Her perfectly manicured fingers hovered over her phone, but she seemed paralyzed by indecision. "Maybe he just needs water," David Park suggested, though his tone betrayed his lack of confidence. He reached for the crystal pitcher that Maya had filled just 10 minutes ago, but his hand shook slightly as he poured, creating tiny ripples across the surface of the ice water. Maya moved closer, her trained eye taking in details that the executives missed, the way that Marcus's skin had taken on a bluish tint around his lips, the irregular rhythm of his chest as it rose and fell, the way his pupils had dilated despite the bright restaurant lighting. These were signs she recognized from the CPR course she had taken 6 months ago at the community center on Maple Street, taught by Mrs. Henderson, a retired nurse who volunteered her time because she believed that everyone deserved to know how to save a life. "He's having a heart attack," Maya said, her voice cutting through the confused murmur of expensive voices like a blade through silk. The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the restaurant's carefully controlled atmosphere was trying to reject this intrusion of harsh reality into its world of careful pretense. Victoria Ashworth looked up at Maya with the expression of someone who had just heard a janitor offer opinions on corporate strategy. "Excuse me, but I think we can handle—"
Marcus's body convulsed once, violently, and then he collapsed forward onto the table. His forehead struck the edge of his dinner plate with a sound like a door slamming shut. Wine glasses toppled, sending Chateau Margaux 2010 cascading across the white linen like blood across snow. The sound of breaking crystal mixed with gasps of shock from nearby tables as other diners turned to witness the unfolding drama. Without hesitation, Maya stepped forward and dropped to her knees beside Marcus's chair. Her uniform skirt would be stained, she knew, and her manager would probably lecture her about proper boundaries between staff and clientele. But Mrs. Henderson's voice echoed in her memory. When someone's life is on the line, nothing else matters. Not your job, not your comfort, not what other people think. Nothing. "Sir, can you hear me?" Maya asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She placed 2 fingers against Marcus's neck, feeling for a pulse as she had practiced on the rubber dummy in the community center's basement. There, weak and irregular, but present. "Sir, I'm going to help you." The board members stood around them like statues, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. Jonathan Hayes had his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in urgent tones to what Maya assumed was emergency services. Eleanor Reeves had stepped back against the wall, one hand pressed to her mouth as if she were trying to hold back words, or perhaps prevent herself from being sick. Maya tilted Marcus's head back slightly, opening his airway as she had been taught. His breathing was shallow and ragged, like someone trying to sip air through a straw. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the restaurant on her, the other diners, the waitstaff, the sommelier who had been approaching their table with the vintage port that cost more per bottle than Maya's monthly rent. "Has anyone called 911?" she asked, without looking up, her fingers checking Marcus's pulse again. Still there, still weak, but holding steady for now. "I did," Jonathan confirmed, his voice tight with stress. "They're on their way. 5 minutes, maybe less." 5 minutes. Maya knew from her training that 5 minutes could be an eternity when someone's heart was failing. She positioned her hands on Marcus's chest, finding the correct placement that Mrs. Henderson had made them practice until their arms ached. The heel of her palm pressed against the center of his chest, her other hand interlaced on top, shoulders directly over her hands, just as she had been taught. But Marcus was still breathing, still had a pulse. CPR wasn't needed yet. What he needed was support, monitoring, and professional medical attention. Maya stayed close, watching for any change in his condition, ready to begin compressions if his heart stopped, ready to tilt his head back and clear his airway if he vomited, ready to do whatever was necessary to keep this stranger alive until help arrived. Around them, the restaurant's carefully orchestrated evening continued in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. In the kitchen, chefs still plated dishes with artistic precision. At other tables, conversations resumed in hushed tones, though every few seconds someone would glance over at the scene unfolding near the window. The maitre d' appeared at Maya's shoulder, offering assistance in the way that service industry professionals do when faced with situations beyond their training. "What can we do?" he asked quietly, his French accent more pronounced than usual under stress. "Keep the area clear," Maya replied, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "And maybe get some clean towels. We might need them." As she knelt there on the expensive carpet, maintaining her vigil over a man she had never spoken to before tonight, Maya couldn't help but think about the strange turns that life could take. 6 months earlier, when she had walked into the Maple Street Community Center on a Tuesday evening in March, she was just another nursing school hopeful trying to pad her resume with certifications that might help her stand out in a competitive program. The fluorescent lights in the basement classroom flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the collection of mismatched chairs that had been donated by various local businesses over the years. Mrs. Henderson, the instructor, was a woman whose hands told stories of 40 years in emergency medicine. She had worked trauma units in 3 different cities, had seen everything from car accidents to overdoses to domestic violence calls that ended with children hiding in closets. But what Maya remembered
most about that first night wasn't Mrs. Henderson's impressive resume. It was the way her voice grew soft when she talked about the people she couldn't save, and the fierce determination in her eyes when she demonstrated chest compressions on Annie, the practice dummy, whose face had been worn smooth by thousands of students learning to breathe life into rubber and plastic. Every year in this country, Mrs. Henderson had said that first night, her hands positioned precisely on Andy's chest. Over 400,000 people die from cardiac arrest. You know what the survival rate is when it happens outside a hospital? Less than 10%. You know why? Because people freeze. They see someone collapse and they think, I'm not qualified for this. I should wait for the professionals. But here's the thing. Brain cells start dying after 4 minutes without oxygen. The ambulance might take 6, 7, maybe 10 minutes to arrive. By the time the professionals get there, the person you could have saved is gone. Maya had signed up for practical reasons, but she stayed for Mrs. Henderson's passion. Every Tuesday evening, for 8 weeks, she learned to recognize the signs of cardiac arrest, to position her hands correctly for chest compressions, to tilt someone's head back and create a seal over their mouth for rescue breathing. She practiced on Annie until her shoulders ached, until she could find the correct hand placement even with her eyes closed, until the rhythm of compressions became as natural as her own heartbeat. But that was training. This was real life, with real stakes and a real person whose survival might depend on her ability to remember everything Mrs. Henderson had taught her in that flickering basement classroom. Maya's days began at 5:30 in the morning with a bus ride from her apartment in Riverside Heights, a neighborhood that real estate agents euphemistically called transitioning, but which Maya's neighbors simply called home. The building where she lived had character, if by character you meant radiators that clanged like industrial percussion and windows that required strategic placement of towels during heavy rains. But it was hers, or at least the rent was hers to pay every month, and from her 4th-floor window she could see the river that gave the neighborhood its name. The commute to downtown took an hour each way, winding through neighborhoods that gradually shifted from struggling to stable to spectacular. She watched the transformation from her bus window every morning and evening, houses growing larger, lawns becoming more manicured, cars shifting from practical sedans to luxury SUVs to vehicles that probably cost more than her family's annual income. By the time the bus reached the financial district, Maya felt like she had traveled not just across the city, but across economic strata that might as well have been different planets. Meridian Restaurant occupied the ground floor of the Cromwell Building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that housed investment firms, law offices, and consultant companies whose names appeared regularly in the business section of the newspaper. The restaurant itself was a study in understated elegance, the kind of place where nothing was overtly flashy, but everything whispered of expense. The art on the walls was original, though never ostentatious. The furniture was handcrafted but appeared effortlessly comfortable. Even the bathroom fixtures were selected with the kind of attention to detail that most people reserved for choosing their wedding china. Maya had been working at Meridian for 2 years, ever since she graduated from community college with an associate's degree in liberal arts and a growing certainty that her future lay in healthcare. The job paid well by restaurant standards, particularly with tips from clients who often spent more on a single dinner than Maya earned in a week. But the real value wasn't in the money. It was in the education. Every evening she served people who wielded the kind of power that shaped cities, who made decisions that affected thousands of jobs, who spoke casually about budgets that could fund entire school districts. She learned to recognize the subtle hierarchies that governed their world: who spoke first in meetings, who paid the check, whose opinions carried weight, and who they were politely ignored. She observed the way they treated service staff, noting which ones said please and thank you, and which ones seemed to view waiters as living furniture. Most of the Meridian clientele were decent enough, if distant. They tipped appropriately, made reasonable requests, and generally treated Maya with the kind of polite indifference that she had come to expect. They weren't cruel, just operating in a different universe, where people like Maya remained largely invisible except when needed to refill water glasses or recommend wine pairings. But Marcus Thorne was different. Not in an obvious way. He still carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms, still wore suits that probably cost more than Maya's monthly budget, still spoke in the measured tones of someone who expected to be listened to. But in small moments, when he thought no one was watching, Maya had noticed things that set him apart from his peers. 3 weeks earlier, she had been clearing dishes from a nearby table when she overheard Marcus talking to Jonathan Hayes about layoffs at one of their subsidiary companies. Most executives would have discussed the numbers, the cost savings, the impact on quarterly projections, and the necessity of staying competitive in a challenging market. But Marcus kept bringing the conversation back to the people: the single mother and accounts receivable who had just bought her first house, the maintenance supervisor who was putting his daughter through college, the security guard who volunteered at the local food bank on weekends. "I know the numbers work better if we eliminate 30 positions," Marcus had said, his voice low enough that Maya had to strain to hear him. But these aren't just positions. They're people with mortgages and families and dreams that we're about to destroy. Can we find another way? Maybe take a smaller profit margin this quarter, maybe delay the executive bonuses?
Maya had pretended to focus on stacking plates, but she filed the conversation away in her memory. She had worked in enough restaurants to know that kindness often revealed itself in unguarded moments, when people forgot they had an audience and spoke from their hearts instead of their calculated public personas. 2 weeks later, she had seen Marcus again, this time dining alone while reviewing what appeared to be financial documents. It was unusual for him to eat without company. Most of the Meridian regulars treated meals as business meetings or social obligations rather than solitary experiences. But there he sat at table 9, occasionally making notes in the margins of spreadsheets while methodically working his way through the restaurant's signature Dover sole. Around 9:30, when most of the other diners had departed for their evening entertainment or headed home to their families, Maya noticed that Marcus had stopped eating. He was staring out the window at the city lights, his expression distant and thoughtful. She approached carefully, unsure whether he wanted company or preferred to be left alone with his thoughts. "Is everything all right with your meal, Mr. Thorne?" she had asked, using the tone that Mrs. Patterson, the restaurant's manager, had taught all the staff: professional but warm, attentive but not intrusive. Marcus looked up at her with what seemed like genuine surprise, as if he had forgotten that he was in a public place surrounded by other people. For a moment, his careful executive mask slipped, and Maya saw something raw in his expression. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the weight of decisions that kept him awake at night. "The meal is perfect, as always," he said, managing a smile that looked only slightly forced. "I was just thinking about how strange it is that we spend so much time planning for the future when we can't even predict what's going to happen tomorrow." Maya nodded politely, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpectedly philosophical observation from someone she had served dozens of times but never really conversed with. Most customers kept their interactions with waitstaff limited to ordering, commenting on the food, or requesting the check. Personal reflections were rare, particularly from someone of Marcus's stature. "Would you like me to wrap up the rest of your dinner?" she asked, defaulting to practical concerns when the emotional landscape became too uncertain. "No, thank you. I think I'll finish it here." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Do you mind if I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you'd rather not." Maya felt a flutter of uncertainty. In her experience, when wealthy clients wanted to ask service staff personal questions, the queries often led to uncomfortable territory, assumptions about her education, her ambitions, her life outside the restaurant. But there was something in Marcus's expression that seemed genuinely curious rather than condescending. "Of course," she said, though she positioned herself slightly closer to the kitchen in case she needed to make a graceful exit. "You always seem so calm," he said, his eyes studying her face as if looking for clues to a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "No matter how busy it gets, no matter how demanding the customers are, you never seem flustered. How do you manage that?" The question surprised Maya with its sincerity. She had expected something more typical: where she was from, whether she was in school, what her plans were for the future. Instead, Marcus seemed genuinely interested in her perspective on managing stress, as if he thought she might have insights that could help him navigate his own challenges. "I guess I learned early that you can only control so much," Maya said slowly, thinking about her family's struggles with her father's health problems and her mother's 2 jobs and her brother's difficulties in school. "When everything feels chaotic, I try to focus on what I can actually do right now, in this moment. The rest will either work out or it won't, but worrying about it doesn't change anything." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if she had shared some profound wisdom rather than simple observations born from necessity. "That's remarkably mature for someone your age. I wish I had learned that lesson earlier in life." The conversation had lasted only a few minutes more before Marcus returned to his documents and Maya continued with her evening duties. But the exchange stayed with her, partly because it was so unusual for a customer to speak to her as an equal, but mostly because she had glimpsed something vulnerable in Marcus Thorne that contrasted sharply with his public image as an unflappable business leader. Now, as she knelt beside his unconscious form on the expensive carpet of his favorite restaurant, Maya wondered if the stress he carried so carefully concealed had finally overwhelmed his body's ability to cope. The man who asked philosophical questions about controlling the future had collapsed in the present moment, leaving his immediate survival dependent on the quick thinking of a waitress who had learned CPR in a community center basement 6 months earlier. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes and 37 seconds after Jonathan Hayes hung up with 911. Though to everyone gathered around Marcus Thorne's motionless form, it felt like hours had passed. Maya heard the sirens first, that distinctive wail that cut through the city's evening symphony of traffic and conversation like a blade through fabric.
His pulse, while the other rested gently on his shoulder, a gesture that probably violated every protocol about professional boundaries, but felt necessary nonetheless. The restaurant's front doors burst open with enough force to rattle the glass panels, and 2 paramedics entered with the kind of controlled urgency that Maya associated with people who faced life-and-death situations as part of their daily routine. The first was a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her partner was younger, maybe early 30s, with the kind of calm competence that suggested years of experience dealing with medical emergencies. "What do we have here?" the female paramedic asked as they approached, already unpacking equipment from the cases they carried. Her name tag read R. Martinez, and her tone was professional but warm. Maya looked up at them with a mixture of relief and reluctance to relinquish her post. Marcus Thorne appears to be in his 50s. He was having dinner when he started complaining of chest pain, difficulty breathing, and his left arm went numb. He collapsed about 6 minutes ago. I've been monitoring his pulse. It's weak but steady. Breathing is shallow but present. Paramedic Martinez kneeled beside Maya, efficiently taking over the assessment while her partner began setting up monitoring equipment. "Good work," she said quietly to Maya. "You did exactly the right thing. Can you tell me anything else about what happened before he collapsed?"
As Maya recounted the sequence of events, she noticed the board members stepping back to give the paramedics room to work. Victoria Ashworth had produced a tissue and was dabbing at her eyes, though whether from genuine emotion or the stress of the situation was unclear. Jonathan Hayes continued speaking in low tones on his phone, presumably notifying other executives or perhaps Marcus's family. Eleanor Reeves stood frozen against the wall, her earlier authority replaced by the helpless expression of someone watching events unfold beyond her control. "Ma'am," the younger paramedic addressed Maya as her partner worked to attach monitors to Marcus's chest. "Are you medical personnel? Your assessment was very thorough." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks as she became aware that the entire restaurant was watching this exchange. "No, I'm a waitress here. I took a CPR class at the community center a few months ago." The simple statement seemed to ripple through the gathered crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Maya saw expressions change on faces throughout the dining room: surprise, admiration, and something that might have been shame among the executives who had stood paralyzed while someone they probably considered their social inferior took charge of the crisis. David Park stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of defensive irritation. "I think we should clarify that we did call emergency services immediately. It's not as if we just stood around doing nothing." Maya felt the implied criticism in his tone, the suggestion that she had somehow overstepped her bounds while taking action while her betters figured out what to do. But before she could respond, paramedic Martinez looked up from her patient with an expression that could have frozen water. "Actually, sir, what this young woman did probably saved your friend's life. When someone collapses from cardiac distress, the first few minutes are critical. She recognized the signs, kept him stable, and provided accurate information that's helping us treat him right now. If you had just stood around waiting for us to arrive, we might be dealing with a very different situation." The rebuke was delivered in the measured tones of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult family members in crisis situations, but its impact was unmistakable. David Park's face reddened, and he stepped back without another word. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Marcus for transport, Maya became aware that the scene had attracted attention from beyond the immediate dining party. Other restaurant patrons had discreetly repositioned themselves to observe the drama unfolding, though they maintained the pretense of continuing their own conversations. I noticed two women at a corner table whispering while glancing repeatedly in her direction, and a man dining alone who had abandoned all pretense of eating while he watched the proceedings with undisguised fascination. "Excuse me," a voice behind Maya said, and she turned to find a woman in an elegant black dress extending a business card. "I'm Patricia Chen from Channel 7 News. I was having dinner when this happened. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Maya stared at the card as if it were written in a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is an incredible story. Successful CEO saved by Waitress who learned CPR at the community center. Our viewers would love to hear about it. The human interest angle is just—" "Ma'am," paramedic Martinez interrupted without looking up from her patient. "This is neither the time nor the place. Please step back and let us do our job." Patricia Chen retreated, but Maya noticed that she remained in the restaurant, occasionally speaking into her phone while keeping a close eye on the ongoing situation. The realization that this private moment of crisis might become public spectacle made Maya's stomach clench with anxiety.
The next few minutes passed in a blur of medical activity. The paramedics established an IV line, administered medications, and prepared Marcus for transport to Metropolitan Hospital. Maya found herself pushed to the periphery of the action, though both paramedics made a point of thanking her for her quick thinking and accurate initial assessment. As they loaded Marcus onto the gurney, Victoria Ashworth approached Maya with an expression that seemed genuinely grateful. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her earlier dismissive attitude completely absent. "If you hadn't acted so quickly." "Anyone would have done the same thing," Maya replied automatically, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She had been the one to act while others stood frozen, and they both knew it. "I don't think that's true," Victoria said quietly, "and I don't think Marcus will forget what you did tonight."
As the ambulance pulled away from the restaurant, its red and blue lights painting the faces of curious onlookers in alternating colors, Maya realized that her quiet life was about to become significantly less quiet. Patricia Chen was still in the restaurant, now openly interviewing other diners about what they had witnessed. The maitre d' was fielding phone calls that were probably from other news outlets who had gotten word of the incident. And Maya was standing in the middle of it all, still wearing her uniform with its wine stains and wrinkles, suddenly transformed from invisible service staff to reluctant hero. The rest of the evening passed in surreal slow motion. Mrs. Patterson, the restaurant manager, insisted that Maya sit down and have something to eat, though food was the last thing on her mind. Other staff members kept approaching her with mixtures of admiration and curiosity, asking questions about her CPR training and whether she had always wanted to be a nurse. The remaining diners whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions that ranged from impressed to uncomfortable. But it was the phone calls that really changed everything. The first came around 10:30, just as Maya was preparing to leave for the evening. Mrs. Patterson appeared at her side with a cordless phone and an expression of bewilderment. "It's for you, someone from the mayor's office." Maya took the phone with trembling hands, uncertain whether this was some elaborate prank or a genuine call from City Hall. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, explaining that Mayor Richardson had heard about the incident and wanted to commend Maya for her heroic actions. There would be a small ceremony next week, the voice explained, where Maya would receive a commendation for civic service. Before Maya could fully process this information, Mrs. Patterson was gesturing for her attention again. "There's another call. This one says they're from Good Morning America." The rest of the evening became a parade of phone calls from news programs, newspapers, and radio stations. Each conversation followed a similar pattern, expressions of amazement that a waitress had possessed the knowledge and courage to save a prominent CEO, requests for interviews, and questions about Maya's background and aspirations. By the time she finally escaped the restaurant around midnight, Maya felt like she had been interviewed more times in one evening than in her entire previous life. The bus ride home gave her the first quiet moments she'd had since Marcus collapsed, and she used them to try to process what had happened. 6 hours earlier, she had been an anonymous service worker going through the familiar motions of another evening shift. Now she was apparently a local hero, with reporters wanting to interview her and the mayor planning to give her an award. But beneath the surreal nature of her sudden fame, Maya felt a deeper satisfaction. She had used the skills Mrs. Henderson taught her to help someone who needed it, and that person was alive because she had acted instead of hesitating. Whatever came next, whatever complications this attention might bring to her life, that fundamental fact remained. Marcus Thorne was breathing tonight because Maya Rodriguez had taken a CPR class at the Maple Street Community Center 6 months ago. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. "Saw the news on Channel 7. So proud of you, mija. Call me when you get home." Maya smiled despite her exhaustion. Her mother cleaned offices in the same downtown district where Maya worked, rising at 4 every morning to empty trash cans and vacuum carpets in buildings that housed companies she'd never heard of. But tonight, her daughter was being called a hero by the same people who barely acknowledged her mother's existence. As the bus pulled into Riverside Heights, she caught her reflection in the window and saw a young woman she barely recognized, not because her appearance had changed, but because something fundamental had shifted in the way she carried herself. She had always known she was capable, had always believed she could handle whatever challenges life presented. But tonight, she had proved it in front of people who would never again be able to dismiss her as just a waitress.
The question now was what to do with this unexpected platform, this sudden visibility that had transformed her from invisible service worker to public figure in the span of a single evening. Whatever came next, Maya knew her life had changed in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. The call from Metropolitan Hospital came at 6:47 the next morning, interrupting Maya's restless sleep with the shrill persistence that only emergency contacts possess. She fumbled for her phone, expecting another reporter or perhaps someone from the mayor's office with details about the commendation ceremony. Instead, she heard the tired but relieved voice of Dr. Sarah Kim from the Cardiac Intensive Care Unit.
Miss Rodriguez, this is Dr. Kim. I'm calling about Marcus Thorne. He specifically asked me to contact you when he woke up. Maya sat up in bed, instantly alert despite having gotten less than 4 hours of sleep. Is he okay? How is he? He's stable. We performed an emergency angioplasty last night. He had a significant blockage in his left anterior descending artery. The quick response he received at the restaurant made all the difference in his outcome. Mr. Thorne wanted me to tell you that he'd like to thank you in person if you're willing to visit. An hour later, Maya stood outside the cardiac ICU wearing the same dress she had worn to her community college graduation ceremony 2 years earlier, the only outfit she owned that seemed appropriate for visiting a CEO in the hospital. She had spent 20 minutes in front of her bathroom mirror trying to tame her hair into something professional before giving up and settling for a simple ponytail that at least looked neat. The ICU was a hushed world of beeping monitors and soft-soled shoes, where life and death decisions were made in whispered consultations, and families waited in uncomfortable chairs for news that might change everything. Maya found Marcus in room 314, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. Without his expensive suit and commanding presence, connected to machines that monitored every heartbeat and breath, he appeared remarkably human. "You came," he said when he noticed her in the doorway, his voice rough from the intubation but carrying genuine warmth. "Please come in. I wasn't sure you would." Maya approached his bedside carefully, unsure of the etiquette for visiting someone whose life you had helped save. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," Marcus admitted with a weak smile, "but Dr. Kim tells me I'm remarkably lucky. She said that if you hadn't recognized what was happening so quickly, if you hadn't kept me stable until the paramedics arrived—" He paused, seeming to gather his strength. "Maya, you saved my life." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying weight that neither of them had expected. Maya had acted on instinct and training, but hearing the gratitude in Marcus's voice made the reality of what had happened suddenly concrete and overwhelming. "I just did what anyone would have done," Maya said, echoing her response from the night before. Marcus shook his head slowly, the motion seeming to require significant effort. "No, that's not true, and you know it." Everyone else in that room froze. Victoria, Jonathan, Eleanor, people who make million-dollar decisions every day. They couldn't act when it really mattered. But you could. You did. Dr. Kim appeared in the doorway, her expression professional but kind. "Mr. Thorne, you shouldn't tire yourself with too much conversation, but I wanted to meet Miss Rodriguez." She turned to Maya with unmistakable admiration. "Your assessment last night was textbook perfect. The paramedics said your description of his symptoms and timeline helped them provide exactly the right treatment during transport. Have you considered a career in medicine?" Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm actually applying to nursing school. This fall, hopefully." "Hopefully?" Marcus asked, his eyebrows raising slightly. "What do you mean, hopefully?" "Well, there's the matter of tuition," Maya said, immediately regretting her honesty. She hadn't meant to burden a man recovering from a heart attack with her financial concerns. "And I need to retake my chemistry prerequisite. I got a B- the first time, but the nursing program requires a B or better in all science courses."
Dr. Kim and Marcus exchanged a glance that Maya couldn't quite interpret. "Miss Rodriguez," Dr. Kim said carefully, "would you mind if I asked which nursing program you're applying to?" "Metropolitan University's Accelerated BSN program. It's competitive, but the graduates have a 98% pass rate on the NCLEX, and they have partnerships with all the major hospitals in the city." "That's an excellent program," Dr. Kim confirmed. "I did my residency here with several nurses who graduated from Metro. Top-notch preparation." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "The chemistry requirement is rigorous, but for good reason. Pharmacology builds on that foundation." "I know. I'm planning to retake it this summer at the community college. It means working fewer shifts at the restaurant, but I'll make it work somehow." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe. Victoria Ashworth stood there holding a bouquet of flowers that probably cost more than Maya's weekly grocery budget, her expression a mixture of relief and something that might have been embarrassment. "Marcus, thank goodness," Victoria said as she entered the room. "When Jonathan told me you were awake and talking, I had to come and see for myself." She noticed Maya and paused. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to apologize for last night." Maya looked puzzled. "Apologize for what?"
For treating you like you didn't know what you were doing. For assuming that because you're... Victoria struggled with her words. For making assumptions about your capabilities, based on your job title, rather than your actual knowledge and skills. The apology was awkward, but seemed genuine, and Maya found herself appreciating Victoria's willingness to acknowledge her mistake. "You were in shock. Everyone reacts differently to emergencies. Some people react by taking action," Victoria said pointedly. "Others stand around making assumptions about who's qualified to help. I know which category I was in last night, and I know which one you were in." Over the next hour, Maya's quiet hospital visit transformed into an impromptu gathering as word spread that Marcus was awake and receiving visitors. Jonathan Hayes arrived with updates from the office and assurances that everything was running smoothly in Marcus's absence. Eleanor Reeves brought news that the board had voted unanimously to postpone all major decisions until Marcus recovered. Even David Park appeared, though his manner remained somewhat stiff and formal. But it was the arrival of Mrs. Henderson that surprised everyone the most. Maya looked up to see her CPR instructor standing in the doorway, her gray hair neatly styled and her expression beaming with pride. "Maya, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, crossing the room to embrace her former student. "I heard about what happened on the morning news. I just had to come and see how our patient was doing." "Mrs. Henderson taught the CPR class where I learned everything," Maya explained to the gathered group. "If she hadn't been such a good instructor, I wouldn't have known what to do." Mrs. Henderson waved away the compliment. "Nonsense. I can teach the techniques, but I can't teach someone to keep their head in a crisis. That comes from character, and you've always had plenty of that." Marcus studied Mrs. Henderson with interest. "You volunteer to teach CPR?" "For 15 years now, ever since I retired from nursing. I figure if I can teach enough people the basics, maybe we can save a few more lives in this city." "How many people have you trained?" Victoria asked. "Oh, hundreds over the years. Maya's class had 12 students, and I probably average 8 or 10 classes per year. Most of them never use what they learn, thank goodness, but every now and then," she smiled at Maya, "every now and then someone like Maya proves that the time was worth it." Dr. Kim had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind if I asked about your nursing background?" 42 years, mostly in emergency and trauma. Started at General Hospital when it was still the old building, retired from here 5 years ago." "Margaret Henderson," Dr. Kim said, recognition dawning in her voice. "You were the charge nurse in the trauma unit when I was an intern. You taught me more about emergency care in 6 months than I learned in 2 years of residency." The connection between Maya's instructor and Marcus's attending physician seemed to crystallize something in the room. What it felt like a series of coincidences, Maya happening to take CPR training, happening to be working that night, happening to recognize the signs of Marcus's cardiac event, suddenly felt like a more interconnected web of preparation and experience. "You know," Marcus said thoughtfully, "I've been lying here thinking about last night, about how everything had to align perfectly for me to survive.
Maya had to take that class, Mrs. Henderson. She had to be working last night. She had the courage to act when everyone else hesitated. But it occurs to me that none of that was really coincidence. What do you mean? Maya asked. I mean that you took that class because you're serious about becoming a nurse. You were working last night because you're paying your own way through school. You acted quickly because you've probably been taking care of people your whole life. This wasn't luck. This was preparation meeting opportunity. Jonathan Hayes, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, suddenly spoke up. Marcus, there's something you should know. The story has gone national. Good Morning America wants to interview Maya tomorrow. The mayor's office called 3 times this morning, and... He paused, seeming uncertain whether to continue. And what? Marcus prompted. The Metropolitan University nursing program called. They want to offer Maya a full scholarship. The room fell silent. Maya felt the world tilt slightly, as if everything she thought she knew about her life had suddenly shifted into a new configuration. I'm sorry, what? Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Maya the screen. It's on their website. University offers full scholarship to hero Waitress. The Dean of Nursing gave a statement saying that your actions last night demonstrated exactly the kind of clinical judgment and composure they want in their graduates.
Maya stared at the headline, reading it 3 times before the words fully registered. A full scholarship would change everything. No more choosing between tuition payments and rent. No more working double shifts to afford textbooks. No more anxiety about student loans that would take decades to repay. There's more, Jonathan continued gently. We've had calls from donors who want to contribute to a fund for your education, and several hospitals have already expressed interest in offering you positions after graduation. I don't understand, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would strangers want to help me? Mrs. Henderson took Maya's hand in both of hers. Because what you did last night reminded people of something important. It reminded them that heroism doesn't come from having fancy titles or expensive education. It comes from being prepared, staying calm, and caring enough about other people to act when action is needed. Marcus nodded from his hospital bed. Maya, you saved my life with knowledge you gained from a community center class and courage you've probably had since childhood. People want to support that. They want to invest in someone who's already proven they'll use their skills to help others. The weight of these revelations was almost overwhelming. In the span of 24 hours, Maya had gone from struggling to afford chemistry prerequisites to being offered a full scholarship to one of the best nursing programs in the state. But even more than the practical benefits, she was struck by the realization that her actions had resonated with people she'd never met, had somehow represented something they valued and wanted to encourage. What do I do now? She asked, the question directed to everyone and no one in particular. Now, Dr. Kim said with a smile, you become the nurse you were always meant to be. And you remember that sometimes the most important things we do start with simply caring enough to pay attention and having the courage to act on what we know is right. As Maya left the hospital that afternoon, her head spinning with scholarship offers and interview requests and opportunities she had never dared to imagine, she thought about the strange alchemy of the previous evening. A routine Tuesday night shift had become a life-changing moment not just for Marcus Thorne, but for her as well. She had discovered that the skills and confidence she'd been quietly building were more powerful than she'd realized, and that sometimes the world was ready to reward someone who combined preparation with courage. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that heroism wasn't about being extraordinary. It was about being ready when ordinary people were needed to do extraordinary things. Her clinical rotations had taken her through different departments at Metropolitan Hospital, where she was beginning to understand the complex ecosystem of modern healthcare. In pediatrics, she learned to comfort frightened children while their parents watched anxiously from bedside chairs. In surgery, she observed procedures that would have seemed like science fiction just a year earlier. In the emergency department, she saw the controlled chaos that she had glimpsed from the outside during Marcus's treatment. But it was her rotation in the cardiac unit where Maya felt most at home. The rhythms of heart monitoring, the careful attention to medication timing, the delicate balance between giving families hope and preparing them for difficult realities, all of it resonated with something deep in her personality. Dr. Kim, who had become an informal mentor, encouraged Maya to consider specializing in cardiac care after graduation. "You have instincts for this work that can't be taught," Dr. Kim had told her during a particularly challenging shift when they'd treated 3 heart attack patients in a single evening. "Some nurses are excellent technically, but struggle with the emotional aspects. Others are wonderfully compassionate, but get overwhelmed by the clinical complexity. You seem to have both sides naturally." The observation had stuck with Maya as she considered her future beyond nursing school. She was still 8 months from graduation, but already she was thinking about the kind of nurse she wanted to become and the contribution she wanted to make to healthcare. Marcus Thorne had recovered fully from his heart attack, returning to work 3 months after his surgery with a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of the people who dedicate themselves to preserving it. He had become an unexpected advocate for healthcare education funding, using his influence to support programs that trained emergency responders and healthcare workers. His company had established a foundation that provided scholarships for students from working-class backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in medicine, nursing, and emergency services. "Maya saved more than my life that night," Marcus had said during the foundation's launch event, which Maya attended as the guest of honor. "She saved my perspective. She reminded me that expertise and courage don't always come with fancy credentials or expensive education. Sometimes they come from people who care enough to learn and prepare themselves to help others." The foundation had already provided scholarships to 15 students in its first year, and Marcus frequently spoke about the need for healthcare training programs in underserved communities. He had visited Mrs. Henderson's CPR classes twice, once to observe and once to speak to students about the real-world impact of their training. Mrs. Henderson had become something of a local celebrity herself, though she seemed more amused than impressed by the attention. The community center had seen a dramatic increase in enrollment for CPR classes, and Mrs. Henderson had recruited 2 additional retired nurses to help meet the demand. She often used Maya's story as an example when teaching new students, but she was careful to emphasize that heroism was available to anyone willing to learn and practice the necessary skills. Maya wasn't born knowing how to respond to a cardiac emergency. She learned it the same way you're learning it, by paying attention, practicing regularly, and caring enough about other people to stay prepared. The only difference between Maya and someone who freezes in an emergency is preparation and practice. The story had indeed gone national, as Jonathan Hayes had predicted. Maya had appeared on Good Morning America, where she spoke about the importance of basic life-saving training and encouraged viewers to take CPR classes in their communities. The interview had been surreal, sitting across from a famous television host, discussing her background and aspirations while millions of people watched. But Maya had tried to focus on the message rather than the attention. "I think people were surprised that a waitress knew what to do when business executives didn't. But that says more about our assumptions than about anyone's actual capabilities. Training and preparation are available to everyone. We just have to decide that learning these skills is important enough to invest the time. The appearance had generated hundreds of emails from viewers sharing their own stories of emergency response, thanking Maya for inspiring them to take training classes or expressing support for her nursing school aspirations. Maya had been touched by the response, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden visibility that had transformed her from anonymous service worker to public figure. More meaningful to her were the quieter recognitions that had followed. The State Nursing Association had given her an award for promoting the profession. The American Heart Association had invited her to speak at their annual conference. Local news stations occasionally interviewed her about healthcare education or emergency preparedness, and she had become comfortable using these platforms to advocate for the programs and people who had made her own success possible. But perhaps the most significant change was in Maya's relationship with her family and community. Her parents, who had always been proud of her ambitions but worried about the financial challenges of nursing school, now spoke about her career with a confidence that filled Maya with quiet satisfaction. Her mother had started attending Mrs. Henderson's CPR classes, determined to learn the skills that her daughter had used to save a life. Her neighborhood in Riverside Heights had embraced Maya's success as a community achievement. The local newspaper ran a monthly column following her progress through nursing school, and Maya had established a small scholarship fund for high school graduates who wanted to pursue healthcare careers but needed help with prerequisites or certification courses.
It's not about the money, Maya explained to a reporter who was writing a follow-up story about her first year in nursing school. It's about showing kids from neighborhoods like mine that these careers are possible. I want them to know that you don't have to come from a medical family or have expensive private school preparation to succeed in healthcare. You just have to care about people and be willing to work hard. On this particular December afternoon, as Maya packed up her simulation lab materials and prepared for her evening study session, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that Tuesday night at Meridian. She was no longer a waitress struggling to afford tuition. She was a nursing student with a clear path to graduation and excellent prospects for employment afterward. She was no longer invisible in the healthcare system. She was preparing to become an integral part of it. But perhaps most importantly, she had discovered that her instincts and values were not just personal traits, but professional assets. The same qualities that had helped her excel in customer service, attention to detail, calm under pressure, genuine care for people's well-being, were exactly what made someone an effective nurse. As she walked across campus toward the library, Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Thorne. "Saw your interview in the university magazine. Proud of how you're using your platform to help others. Looking forward to hearing about your graduation plans." Maya smiled as she typed back, "Still 8 months to go, but I'm getting there. Thank you for everything you've done to make this possible." The response came quickly. "You made it possible. We just cleared away some of the obstacles." It was a generous way to frame the situation, but Maya knew there was truth in both perspectives. She had created the opportunity through her preparation and actions, but the support she'd received afterward had amplified that opportunity into something much larger than she could have achieved alone. She had learned that heroism and success were rarely solo achievements. They emerged from the intersection of individual preparation with community support, personal courage with systemic opportunity. Her story wasn't just about one person saving another in a moment of crisis. It was about what became possible when society decided to invest in someone who had proven they would use their skills and knowledge to help others. As Maya settled into her favorite corner of the library, surrounded by textbooks on pharmacology and pathophysiology, she thought about the future she was building. In 8 months, she would graduate with her BSN and begin working as a registered nurse. In a few years, she might pursue a master's degree in cardiac care or emergency nursing.
Eventually, she hoped to teach, to become the kind of mentor for future nurses that Mrs. Henderson had been for emergency responders. But all of that was still ahead. For now, there was studying to do, skills to master, and knowledge to gain. Maya opened her pharmacology textbook and began reviewing cardiac medications, preparing for tomorrow's exam with the same careful attention to detail that had served her well as a waitress and that would serve her even better as a nurse. 3 years later, Maya Rodriguez, RN, BSN, adjusted her stethoscope as she walked through the cardiac intensive care unit at Metropolitan Hospital, the soft squeak of her sneakers against the polished floor providing a steady rhythm to her morning rounds. The early shift always brought a particular kind of energy to the unit, a sense of new beginnings mixed with the quiet intensity that came from caring for patients whose hearts had betrayed them in one way or another. Room 314 held a 73-year-old retired teacher named Eleanor Washington, who had suffered a massive myocardial infarction 2 days earlier. As Maya checked Eleanor's monitors and adjusted her medications, she couldn't help but remember another patient who had occupied this same room 3 years ago, a CEO named Marcus Thorne, whose life had taken an unexpected turn during a dinner at an upscale restaurant. "How are you feeling this morning, Mrs. Washington?" asked Maya, her voice carrying the warmth that had become her signature as a nurse. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Eleanor replied with a weak smile, unknowingly echoing Marcus's words from years earlier. "But the doctors tell me I'm lucky." "You are lucky," Maya confirmed, reviewing the chart on her tablet. "Your angioplasty went perfectly and your heart function is already improving. The quick response you received made all the difference." Eleanor's daughter, who had been maintaining a bedside vigil since the emergency, looked up at Maya with grateful eyes. "The paramedic said that if our neighbor hadn't known CPR, we might have lost Mom. Mrs. Peterson learned it at some community center class just last year." Maya smiled, thinking of Mrs. Henderson, who was still teaching CPR classes at the Maple Street Community Center at age 74. Community preparation saves lives. Your neighbor's training made the difference between a close call and a tragedy.
As Maya continued her rounds, she reflected on how the ripple effects of that night at Meridian continued to spread in ways she was only beginning to understand. The story of the waitress who saved the CEO had inspired thousands of people to take CPR training, and Maya regularly heard from patients whose lives had been saved by neighbors, coworkers, or family members who had learned emergency response skills after hearing about her experience. The foundation that Marcus had established now provided scholarships to over 200 students annually, and Maya served on its selection committee, helping to identify candidates who combined academic potential with the kind of character that would serve them well in healthcare careers. Many of the scholarship recipients came from backgrounds similar to her own, working families where college had seemed financially impossible until someone recognized their potential and provided support. 5 years later, Maya stood at the podium in the University of Chicago's Medical School auditorium, looking out at an audience of medical students, residents, and practicing physicians who had gathered for the annual symposium on emergency cardiac care. Her presentation was titled Community Preparedness and Cardiac Survival, Lessons from 5 Years of Data, and it represented the culmination of research she had been conducting since completing her Master of Science in Nursing with a focus on cardiac care. "When we look at survival rates for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest," Maya said, clicking to a slide that showed dramatic improvements in her city's statistics over the past 5 years, we see that community education initiatives have had a measurable impact on patient outcomes. Cities that have invested in widespread CPR training, AED placement, and public awareness campaigns have seen survival rates increase by as much as 40%. The data was compelling, but Maya knew that behind every statistic was a human story. Someone's father who survived a heart attack at a Little League game because the coach knew CPR. Someone's grandmother who was saved by a grocery store clerk who had learned emergency response skills after hearing about her experience. Someone's colleague who received life-saving care from a coworker who had prepared for a situation they hoped never to encounter. Dr. Kim, now the chief of cardiology at Metropolitan Hospital, had encouraged Maya to pursue research that could inform public health policy. Your unique perspective, having been both the immediate responder and now a cardiac care specialist, gives you insights that pure clinicians or pure researchers might miss. You understand both the human and the systems aspects of emergency response. Maya's research had attracted attention from the American Heart Association, which had funded a larger study examining the relationship between community education programs and cardiac survival rates in major metropolitan areas. The preliminary results suggested that every dollar invested in public CPR training generated between $4 and $7 in healthcare savings through improved patient outcomes and reduced long-term care costs. But Maya's favorite part of her expanding role was the teaching. She had developed a program that brought nursing students and medical residents into community centers to learn alongside ordinary citizens in CPR classes. The program served multiple purposes. It gave healthcare trainees experience with public education, it increased the credibility and visibility of community training programs, and it broke down barriers between medical professionals and the communities they served. When nursing students and residents train alongside grocery store clerks and retired teachers, Maya explained to her audience, everybody benefits. The future healthcare providers see that clinical knowledge isn't limited to people with medical degrees, and the community members gain confidence in their ability to provide meaningful assistance in emergency situations. 7 years later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Maya Rodriguez Community Health Education Center took place on a crisp October morning with representatives from the mayor's office, the hospital administration, and the nursing school gathered to celebrate the opening of a facility that would provide free training in CPR, first aid, and basic health education to residents throughout the metropolitan area. Maya stood beside the ribbon, holding oversized scissors that felt surprisingly heavy in her hands, surrounded by people who had become integral parts of her journey over the past 7 years. Mrs. Henderson, now 81 but still sharp and determined, stood to her right, wearing the same smile she had worn when Maya first mastered chest compressions in that basement classroom. Marcus Thorne, whose foundation had provided the lead funding for the center, stood to her left, his presence a reminder of how far they had all traveled from that evening at Meridian restaurant. 7 years ago, Maya said to the gathered crowd, I learned CPR in a community center basement because I thought it might help me get into nursing school. I never imagined that those skills would save someone's life, or that saving one life would lead to opportunities to save many more. This center represents the belief that life-saving knowledge should be available to everyone, regardless of their background or economic circumstances. The center would offer classes 7 days a week, with evening and weekend sessions to accommodate people with various work schedules. It would partner with local schools to provide training to teachers and students, with businesses to train employees, and with community organizations to reach populations that might not otherwise have access to medical education. Dr. Kim, who had agreed to serve on the center's medical advisory board, spoke about the broader implications of community health education. When we teach people to recognize the signs of stroke, heart attack, and other medical emergencies, we're not just training them to help others, we're creating a more health-conscious community overall. People who understand basic medical concepts are more likely to seek appropriate care for themselves and their families.
The center would also serve as a training site for nursing and medical students, continuing Maya's commitment to breaking down barriers between healthcare professionals and the communities they served. Maya had recently completed her doctoral degree in nursing practice, focusing her dissertation research on community-based health education programs and their impact on population health outcomes. Her research had confirmed what she had suspected from her own experience, that widespread health education created ripple effects that extended far beyond emergency response. Communities with higher levels of health literacy had better rates of preventative care, earlier detection of chronic diseases, and more effective management of conditions like diabetes and hypertension. 10 years later, Maya walked through the cardiac unit at Metropolitan Hospital, now serving as the Director of Cardiac Nursing Education, overseeing a team of nurses who trained other healthcare providers in advanced cardiac care. Her office wall was decorated with photographs from a decade of graduations, award ceremonies, and community events that told the story of how one evening had evolved into a lifetime of commitment to healthcare education. The latest photograph showed her receiving the American Heart Association's National Award for Community Education, presented at a ceremony in Dallas where she had spoken to an audience of 3,000 healthcare providers about the importance of building bridges between professional medicine and community preparedness. But her favorite photograph wasn't from a formal ceremony. It was a candid shot, taken at the community center's 5th anniversary celebration, showing Maya teaching CPR to a group that included a 9-year-old girl whose grandmother had suffered a heart attack the previous year. The girl, named Sophia, had watched her parents panic while paramedics worked to save her grandmother, and she had decided that she never wanted to feel helpless in an emergency again. "Miss Maya," Sophia had said after mastering the rhythm of chest compressions, "when I grow up, I want to be a nurse like you so I can help people." Maya had knelt down to Sophia's level and said, "You're already helping people by learning these skills. Being a nurse would be wonderful, but there are lots of ways to make a difference in people's lives. The most important thing is to care about others and be prepared to help when help is needed." The conversation had reminded Maya of her own journey from a young woman who took a CPR class for practical reasons to someone whose life had been shaped by a single moment of crisis and the decision to act rather than hesitate. She had learned that heroism wasn't about dramatic gestures or extraordinary circumstances. It was about preparation meeting opportunity, compassion meeting competence, and courage meeting crisis. The Community Health Education Center now operated 4 locations throughout the metropolitan area, and similar programs had been established in dozens of other cities based on Maya's research and advocacy. The model had been featured in medical journals, policy reports, and public health conferences as an example of how communities could take ownership of health education and emergency preparedness. Maya's own career had evolved beyond what she had imagined possible when she first walked into Mrs. Henderson's CPR class. She held faculty appointments at 2 universities, served on advisory committees for national health organizations, and was frequently invited to speak at conferences around the country. But she had never lost sight of the fundamental lesson that had shaped her path, that the most important skills were often the simplest ones, and that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were properly prepared and motivated by genuine care for others. 15 years later. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered to Maya's office at the university where she now served as a professor of nursing and director of the Center for Community Health Education. The return address indicated it was from Sophia Martinez, née Sophia Chen, the 9-year-old girl who learned CPR at the community center's anniversary celebration. And Maya opened it with curiosity about what had prompted correspondence from someone she hadn't heard from in several years. "Dear Professor Rodriguez," the letter began, "I wanted to let you know that I graduate from nursing school next month, and I've been accepted into the cardiac care specialty program at Metropolitan Hospital. I often think about that day at the community center when you taught me CPR and how you said that caring about others and being prepared to help was the most important thing. That conversation shaped everything I've done since then." Maya smiled as she continued reading. Sophia had indeed become a nurse, following a path that included undergraduate study in biology, volunteer work with emergency medical services, and extensive experience in community health education. Her application to the cardiac specialty program had included a personal statement about the importance of community preparedness and the ways that professional healthcare providers could support and enhance public health education. "I wanted you to know," the letter continued, "that I've accepted a position that will split my time between clinical practice and community education.
I'll be working with the latest expansion of the Community Health Education Center, helping to develop programs for Spanish-speaking communities and working with recent immigrants who might not otherwise have access to health education resources. The letter represented something Maya had hoped for but never dared to expect, that the programs and values she had helped establish would inspire a new generation of healthcare providers who understood the importance of connecting professional medicine with community empowerment. Maya's own career had continued to evolve in directions that surprised even her. Her research on community health education had influenced national policy recommendations for emergency preparedness. Her advocacy had contributed to legislation that provided federal funding for public health education programs in underserved communities. Her teaching had shaped hundreds of nursing students who carried lessons about compassion, preparation, and community engagement into healthcare systems across the country. But perhaps most importantly, she had helped create a model that demonstrated how individual action could catalyze systemic change. The story that had begun with a waitress recognizing a cardiac emergency had evolved into a movement that had saved thousands of lives and empowered countless communities to take ownership of their health and safety. 20 years later, Maya stood before the mirror in her dressing room at the Today Show studio, adjusting the jacket of her navy blue suit and thinking about how surreal it still felt to be preparing for national television appearances. She was scheduled to discuss her new book, Prepared Hearts: How Community Education Saves Lives, which had just been published to mark the 20th anniversary of the incident that had changed her life. The book combined personal narrative with research findings and policy recommendations, tracing the evolution from one evening's emergency response to a national movement for community health education. It had already been featured in major newspapers and magazines, and Maya had been invited to speak at conferences, universities, and policy forums across the country. But perhaps most importantly, she had helped create a model that demonstrated how individual action could catalyze systemic change. The story that had begun with a waitress recognizing a cardiac emergency had evolved into a movement that had saved thousands of lives and empowered countless communities to take ownership of their health and safety. What would you tell someone who's thinking about taking a CPR class but isn't sure it's worth their time? The host asked. Maya smiled, thinking of all the lives that had been saved by people who had once asked themselves that same question. I'd tell them that you never know when someone you love might need you to be prepared. But more than that, I'd tell them that learning these skills connects you to your community in a way that nothing else can. When you know how to help in an emergency, you become someone others can count on. And that changes not just what you can do for other people, it changes how you see yourself. After the interview, as Maya sat in the green room answering emails from viewers who had been inspired by her story, she received a text message from Sofia Martinez, who is now the director of community outreach for the cardiac center where Maya had once been a patient visitor. Watching you on TV this morning, thinking about that 9-year-old girl who wanted to learn CPR so she could help people. Still learning, still helping, still grateful for teachers who believed that everyone deserves to know how to save a life. Maya typed back, and still teaching, still inspiring, still proving that the most important lessons are the ones we pass on to others. As Maya walked through the bustling streets of Manhattan after the interview, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken. 20 years ago, she was a waitress struggling to afford nursing prerequisites. Today, she was a nationally recognized advocate whose work had influenced health policy and saved thousands of lives. But the true measure of success wasn't in the awards or recognition. It was in the network of prepared communities that had grown from that single evening at Meridian restaurant. Across the country, ordinary people were equipped with life-saving skills. Healthcare workers understood their role in community education, and policies supported public health preparedness.
Maya's phone buzzed with a message from Sofia Martinez. Watching you on TV this morning. Thinking about that 9-year-old girl who wanted to learn CPR so she could help people. Still learning, still helping, still grateful for teachers who believed that everyone deserves to know how to save a life. Maya typed back, and still teaching, still inspiring, still proving that the most important lessons are the ones we pass on to others.